Before we start, tell me this. Where are you tuning in from tonight, my friends? The vast, open desert, a bustling city, or perhaps somewhere far off, distant from here? Allow me to share with you the tale of Franklin Grady and the spring, reckoning that forever altered the course of his life. The desert stirred slowly that morning, still half dreaming, its breath cool with the lingering remnants of the night. The first light of dawn crept over the distant ridges, spilling softly like liquid gold across the horizon, its touch caressing the stone and brush as if it had all the time in the world. Franklin Grady sat on his saddle, perched at the edge of this nascent daylight, his hat pulled low over his brow, his eyes squinting into the growing day, already anticipating what was to come. The wind had a faint, biting edge, carrying with it the dry, earthy scent of sagebrush, mingled with something more distant wood smoke, thin and far off. It wafted through the morning quiet in a way that pricked at his senses. For smoke like this didn't drift so calmly without something more beneath it. Instinctively, he urged his horse forward, moving toward the source of the scent. His horse's hooves barely made a sound against the hard-packed earth, and his shadow stretched long beside him, bending and swaying across the pale stones like some kind of omen. Franklin had learned long ago not to rush toward the unknown. But there was a tug in his chest, a quiet but insistent feeling that something was wrong, a feeling no measured pace could shake. The closer he got, the more the wind carried the scent of that smoke. Not the lively crackling of a campfire, but a brittle, eerie silence, as though something had been interrupted. And then, as if the land itself held its breath, he saw it. The trail led him to a shallow ravine, where a wagon lay tipped on its side, its canvas torn and singed at the edges. Barrels were shattered, their contents spilled out in a wild scatter, white flour blooming against the red dust like ghostly petals. A tin plate, caught by the wind, wobbled and rattled gently in the breeze. There were fresh hoof prints, sharp and distinct, leading away toward the jagged stone teeth of the hills in the distance. Franklin reined in his horse, halting at the edge of the scene. He sat still, letting the silence of the desert speak to him, as though the land itself might offer some answer to the unsettling sight before him. A faint sound drifted to his ears, barely audible above the whisper of the wind, something almost lost in the vast stillness. A muffled cry, cut short in a way that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Without hesitation, he urged his horse forward, the feeling in his chest tightening, and followed the sound into the unknown. He found them in Theli of a boulder, guarded by 3 men whose faces bore the dust and weariness off long roads, but none of ease of phonous travel. The 2 women sat on the ground, wrists bound before them, hair loose and tangled from struggle. Their clothing was of the Apache woven skirts, beaded sashes, the subtle patterns off their people's handiwork. One's eyewear dark and steady, despite the fur thought tensed her jaw. The other's gaze flitted between the men, calculating, waiting. They could not have been more than 25, 26 at most. Franklin stayed, in the shadow of a mess, weighing Thessine. He knew the look of an abductionment for ransom, or worse. His gut turned hard. He thought of a spring years back, of his sister's laughter, vernishing into the dust behind riders heckled not catch. He had been younger then, slower, too full of hesitation. Eth had carved something deep in him, a hollow that never closed. Looking at these women, he felt the old wounds. Urging, he rode forward slow. His voice even told the men the desert wasn't kind to those who made enemy sure none were needed. Offered a trade, supplies, coin, anything to see the women freed. The eldest of them, wearing a sun-faded Mexican cavalry jacket, spit into the dust and told him to keep riding unless he wanted trouble. Another lord, the sound sharp as a snapped twig. Franklin's hand rested on the worn grip off his Colt. The younger sister looked at him then, her gaze locking with his, not pleading, not breaking. It was a challenge, a dare to see whether the Manon, the horse, was worth the dust on his boots. That was the moment he moved first. His revolver was our blur, the crack splitting the air and dropping the man in the jacket before others had drawn. Gunfire erupted, hot and shattering. Franklin felt the first bullet tear into his shoulder, spinning him half around in the saddle. Another punched into his side, another into his thigh. He gritted against their pain, firing back. Each shot a piece of himself given away. The world narrowetto, the smell of gunpowder and the rasp of his own breath. When the last manful silence rushed in like water into a breached hole, Franklin's vision wavered. He swayed, felt the saddle slip from under him, and hit the ground hard. The women's bindings were gone in a heartbeat, their hands warm, steady, pressing against his wounds. They spicito each other in low, urgent Apache, tearing strips from their skirts to staunch the bleeding. He wanted to tell them to run, that more might be coming, but the words dissolved on his tongue. They half dragged, half lifted him, and toe his gelling. One leading the reins were leathy, other kept pressure on his side. Thegeny blurred, stone and sky passing in jolts, the rhythm of hooves like Afaroff drum. Then there was the scent of wood smoke again, richer now, mingled with cooking meat and the faint temps of tanned hides. The camp unfolded from the shadows of cottonwoods, hides stretched between poles, children darting like quick birds. Women bent to their work, men stood watch, their eyes sharp as. The two sisters called out and the camp shifted, faces turning, voice rising in recognition and relief. A man stepped forward, tall and broad, his hair bound with a strip of red cloth. Highsize found the wounds before they found Franklin's face. The look he gave him held the weight of understanding and gratitude that needed no words. Franklin was eased onto a bedroll inside a low shelter of hides. The air was warm, smelling of cedar and smoke. Time slipped in and out. He surfaced to see Hun's sister spooning broth toward his lips, to feel the other's hand on his forehead, cool and sure. Sometimes they spoke to him in soft tones, their voice of music he did not understand, but felt all the same. On the third day, he managed more than a few words, rough and told them his name, asked for the older was Lou, the young. They told him fragments of their capture, how they had been taken on that trail to a trading post, how the men who held them had spoken of selling them across the border. Franklin's jaw tightened at that, but they touched his arm, as though to ease the storm they saw gathering in him. By the seventh evening, he could sit propped against a woven mat. The camp was quieter than usual, the sun spilling its last gold over the hills. The tall man, Lou, and Ahiv's father, the chief, entered and sat beside him. His voice was like stone wern, smooth by years of water. Had told Franklin that his daughters had been returned because of him, and that such a debt could not be left unsettled. He offered him a place among their people, not as a guest, but as kin. Franklin felt the pull of it after so many years. Drifting from town to town, the idea of belonging gnawed at him in a way he did not expect. But before he could shape an answer, shouts rose from the edge of camp. Riders crested the horizon, dark against the dying light, 6 of them, hard-faced and armed. Franklin knew them by the cut of their coats and the hunger in their eyes. Kin off the men he'd killed, riding for vengeance. The camp moved quick. Men took up rifles. Women pulled children into shelters. Franklin pushed to his feet, the pain in his wounds flaring white, but he reached for his Colt all the same. The chief told him to stay down, but Franklin shook his head. He would not lie in the dark while others stood in his place. The riders came first, their yells cutting the even. The first shots cracked, echoing against the stone. Franklin took position beside the chief, bracing against a post. His revolver steadied despite the weakness in his limbs. Dust and gunfire mingled in the air. Thrilled reduced to flashes of movement and the raw rhythm of survival. A rider broke through the line, bearing down on the sisters, and Franklin stepped it forward into the path, firing until the mont fell. Pain roared through him, his body threatening to give, but he held. The sky above had deepened to a bruised purple, and in its shadow edge, the last rider turned to flee. Franklin took one step after him, then another, and the ground seemed to swab beneath him like the deck of a ship. His knees buckled, the world tilting, the sounds of the camp blurring into a far-off hum. He heard someone calling his name, felt the brush of hands at his, and then there was nothing but the sound of his own breath, ragged and fading, and the knowledge that he had stood where he was needed, and would again if he had the strength. The night closed, and around him, thick with pheasant of smoke and iron, the echoes of the battle still hanging in the air, like here, promise not yet fulfilled.